Hey guys, Gamer3427 here. Let's analyze the Polygun. For those unaware, the Polygun is a new long gun added to the game with Remnant 2's second DLC. This gun can be acquired by completing a somewhat annoying scavenger hunt in the Labyrinth, where you have to destroy a series of nodes across the entire map without dying. I'll leave a link to a video guide in the description, but just a heads up that completing this can be kinda time consuming and frustrating, which has led to a lot of people's disappointment for what seems like a somewhat mediocre gun at first glance. That said, I've been using the gun quite a lot since I first obtained it, and once you get used to it, it is actually quite effective. It does have some major drawbacks however, and mastering it requires learning how to work around those drawbacks, which may be a deal breaker for some players, particularly when there's lots of guns out there that can do the same or more overall damage with the right setups, while being much simpler to use. This gun has a lot to talk about though, so let's have a look. To start with, let's look at the Polygun stats. Its unique mod allows it to swap between two different firing modes. You have the long range rifle mode and the close range shotgun mode. In rifle mode, the gun's damage and stats sit fairly closely in line with semi-auto rifles, and sits somewhere between the Huntmaster and the Wrangler. But it is capable of firing in full auto, so it does have a pretty decent fire rate overall. In shotgun mode, however, its stats are pretty comparable to the Sparkfire shotgun. When you switch between the two modes, the stats will change in the equipment menu, letting you do a more direct comparison between it and other weapons. When firing, after 2 shots, your third shot will cause the gun to overheat and cause a self-damaging overload effect unless you perform a manual reload. Doing so will cause a gauge to pop up underneath the reticle, replacing the overheat bar. And if you press the reload button again when the arrow points to the white part of the gauge, you'll perform an active reload much like in Gears of War. If you let the arrow reach the end, you'll simply perform a normal reload. Mistiming the gauge will cause the gun to jam, and you'll be unable to fire, swap weapons, or activate relics or abilities for a short duration, though you can still dodge. The same happens when you fire too many shots and trigger the overheat effect. The size of the trigger zone on the gauge is directly related to how much of the overheat gauge you had filled prior to reloading. So ideally, unless you're confident in your ability to time it properly, you'll want to be one shot away from an overheat before attempting to reload. When you do successfully hit the active reload, a tick mark will fill in below the reticle. For each of these tick marks, the heat generation of the gun decreases, allowing you an extra shot per mark before reloading. These marks last for about 6 seconds before decaying, and performing another active reload in that time frame will reset the timer. If a mark goes away while firing, the heat generation will return to the previous level, meaning that if you're not careful, the heat gauge will fill unevenly, making it impossible to fully fill the gauge before reloading. If you perform an active reload when you already have 3 full marks, this will put the gun into overdrive, preventing all heat generation for an unlimited time and basically giving you unlimited ammo. After about 6 seconds, the gun will go back to its 3 mark state and will begin heat generation again, allowing you to smoothly loop back into overdrive mode if you can perform another active reload after a few shots. If at any point the gun overheats or you miss an active reload and cause it to jam, you will lose all your tick marks and have to start back from square one. Letting the reload progress fully, however, does not, though by the time it finishes, you may end up losing a single stack due to the natural decay timer. Before we go into damage comparisons, I'll try to run through a few other observations and notes real quick. As far as general mechanics go, the overheat gauge doesn't decrease other than by reloading or overheating. I will say at one point I did have a really weird glitch when I was in a random multiplayer session where it did perform like a normal overheat gauge, but I couldn't replicate this glitch. I'm not sure what caused it to trigger. It just kind of was a thing that happened and shouldn't be relied upon as something you can do unless someone finds a way to consistently cause that to happen. Overheat, reload, and mod usage related effects won't trigger from its mechanics. Effects related to ammo don't trigger, with the exception of top heavy, which is always active, and that basically just means you have a permanent damage boost if you have the top heavy mutator equipped. As far as the overheat self-damage goes, it can kill you if you're low enough health. It can trigger on damage effects from equipment and is considered elemental damage for the sake of a few rings and effects that will trigger if you take damage. However, it will not trigger it if the equipment specifies that it has to be enemy damage, so keep that in mind. You can also dodge out of it and trigger perfect dodge effects if you have the right timing. As far as a couple of mode-specific effects, I will say that in shotgun mode, weapon spread bonuses will affect it, allowing you to tighten up the shotgun blast, just like with any other shotgun. As far as the rifle mode, since it is full auto, fire rate bonuses are particularly effective on it, so long as you can manage to control your heat gauge when firing in full auto. Now then, let's talk about how much damage you're actually getting from the gun. For these tests, I removed all my armor, equipment, mutators, reset my traits, set my class to only be Explorer, so that I had absolutely nothing affecting the gun's damage. For the shotgun mode, I tested against the Sparkfire shotgun, and for the rifle mode, I tested against the Huntmaster. Since the Polygun has unlimited ammo reserves, I first tested how long it would take to completely empty those reserves for each comparison gun, then saw how many shots I could fire from the Polygun in the same time frame while maintaining perfect reloads. After that, I tested how much damage each gun could do with body shots against the training dummies with unlimited reserves for 60 seconds. This is just to get a baseline damage numbers for comparison, so keep in mind that your actual mileage will absolutely vary based on what gear and classes you're using. What's more, given the nature of the Polygun's reload mechanic, you will absolutely find that its damage won't reach max potential in most fights, due to either user error or having to spend time dodging, causing you to lose stacks due to their decay rate. This video is going to be somewhat long as is, so I'll mostly cut to the chase on the data here. But if you want more comprehensive details, I'll leave a link to the Reddit thread I originally posted with my testing results, some earlier thoughts, and additionally comparing the Wrangler rifle. For the Sparkfire, in shotgun mode, it takes about 40 seconds to fully burn through all of its ammo, including reserves, during which time the Polygun can get off about 49 shots, only doing about 500 points more damage in all. On the 60-second test, however, the Polygun does roughly 5,000 more damage. For comparison to the Huntmaster in rifle mode, it takes about 45 seconds to burn through all of its ammo, during which time the Polygun can get off about 80 shots, doing about 6,000 more damage. Then in the 60-second test, we can see a damage difference of about 10,000 in the Polygun's favor. Now, what do these damage numbers mean in actuality? Mainly, they show that the Polygun has potential to ramp up its damage the longer you can keep going, and the gaps only increase the longer it goes due to the combination of having infinite ammo reserves and only having short reloads with decent stretches where you won't have to reload at all if you keep triggering the overdrive mode. On counterpoint to this, however, is that it's very rare for you to have situations where you're firing endlessly at a target, particularly on higher difficulties where enemies would have enough health to get the most out of it. Even more so is the potential for losing a lot of that damage output should you mess up a reload or let your marks decay. As such, your mileage for its usefulness on a per encounter basis will vary quite a bit when compared to more standard guns. Overall, I think the Polygun is probably the most quote-unquote skill-based gun in the game. It has a lot of potential for raw damage, but it also has a lot of potential for you to ruin that damage should you struggle with its mechanics. This can lead to a lot of players getting frustrated with it as they're testing it out, and leads to the reputation it currently seems to have as being a bad gun. I can't say I don't understand the sentiments, particularly as there's many other guns you can simply use without any drawbacks or really having to worry about anything beyond just pressing the fire buttons or the mod button. And while it does have potential for some really good damage, in reality you may not see that damage as often as you would with other comparable weapons. Where its real potential lies is more in its utility. Being able to switch between long and close range on the fly and having infinite ammo reserves are both quite good depending on how you play, particularly as this lets you save your secondary or melee slots for something more niche that you may only bring out on occasion. There's also the potential for using it for self-damage or perfect dodge builds, turning it into a buffing tool more than a gun, that is arguably much safer to use on hard difficulties than relying on enemy attacks. For me, I find it to be just a rather satisfying general purpose weapon I can bring with me. I've tried it across a few different build setups, and personally the main setup I found that I like using it with is alongside a skill-heavy general damage build, essentially to mop up enemies or save skill uses during smaller sections. I've also gotten used to the reload mechanic to the point where many times in the heat of battle, I can perform the active reload without even watching the gauge, just due to being so used to the timing on it. This in turn leads me to think that if someone gets particularly good at it, they could probably trigger the overdrive mode after just a few shots fairly consistently, just by being able to constantly time the reload with the smaller gauges. I did a little bit of testing on this myself and I could get it to work, I just couldn't do it consistently, so it would really depend on the user's skill on whether or not that would be an option. On that note, before I close out, here's a few general tips and tricks I've found for making use of it. First and foremost, don't feel like you have to try for every active reload. If you're in the middle of a fight and something is pressing down on you, sometimes it's better to just let the reload happen normally than to try and hit the active reload and risk the gun jamming. This is particularly true for situations where your overheat gauge has become unbalanced. While I rarely do it, you can build up the gauge outside of combat as well. If you want to, you can even get to full overcharge and keep maintaining that between fights so that you go into a fight with it fully primed. There's no need to worry about wasting ammo, so feel free to paint the walls with bullet holes if you really want. Even if you're not wanting to go that far, you can at least build up a full gauge so you can start your next counter with a reload to get the ball rolling. On the opposite end of that, you can also choose to reload after every fight to return the gun to a neutral starting state, making sure you always go into the next fight with the gauge empty so you can get a couple of shots off right off the bat. Don't be afraid to let the overload happen if you ever just need one last shot on an enemy. It'll hurt a bit, but it'll hurt a lot less than getting hit by an enemy that's almost dead. While it might be counterintuitive towards the idea of using the gun, don't be afraid to switch to your secondary weapon depending on the situation. If you find yourself getting flustered and repeatedly jamming or overheating the gun in a tough moment, bring out your secondary for a bit until you calm down and get back into the flow of things. Ultimately, I think what it comes down to, though, is whether you enjoy using the gun itself. It can either be really satisfying or really frustrating depending on how you view it. It has solid base damage and good overall damage potential, but isn't particularly outstanding beyond that. For me, it has a certain fun factor that is constantly engaging, unlike a lot of guns. And I'll never get tired of just how satisfying it is to shotgun an enemy up close, switch to the rifle mode to shoot an enemy in the distance, then switch back to shotgun mode to take out something that came up as I was reloading. I think for what it is, the gun is in a good place. While I'd like to possibly see an adjustment to the rate at which the marks fall off, otherwise I don't really have any complaints for the gun. It's not the next Enigma, but it's a rather solid gun for those who can get into using it, and I think that's all it really aspires to be. But what do you think? Comment down below and let me know your thoughts on whether or not you'd like to see more content like this from me in the future. Until then, thank you all for watching and have a good one.